Okay, hi everyone. Very warm welcome, and thank you very much for the very kind invitation to be here. And happy Halloween for those who celebrate it. So yeah, my name is Aidan McGarry. I work at Loughborough University. It's actually one of the most difficult words in the English language to say, is because it looks like Loughborough, and everybody struggles with, but it's pronounced Loughborough. And I'm going to talk about my book. I'm going to talk about the relationship between protest and democracy, and that is what my book focuses on. And in particular, I'm interested in the relationship, or specifically how marginalized groups, marginalized people who are not included in the formal political system, like representative democracy, how they make themselves heard and how they negotiate this. And maybe one of the kind of the subtext kind of questions that I'll be looking at in my book as well as in this talk tonight is can protest save democracy? Which is quite a provocative thing to say, but maybe not so provocative either. So I'll be arguing that in order to be visible and recognized in public life, marginalized people must speak up and speak out, often through protest. And then as they articulate this collective voice through protest, they actually bolster democracy, an institution which frequently excludes them. So here we have an immediate kind of paradox. On the one hand, representative democracies often exclude some groups, yet they are built on principles like freedom of speech and freedom of association that ensures that individuals and groups can express themselves and their identities freely. So democracy makes protest possible, and in turn, protests enrich democratic principles. So what I'm suggesting is not an antagonistic relationship between protest and democracy. In many ways, they are quite complementary. And it's also no surprise that protests thrive in democracies, and they tend to atrophy in authoritarian regimes with limited or no civil society and extant freedoms. So yeah, so I'm looking at the relationship between protest and democracy. Tonight I'm going to I'll try and talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. I'll begin by setting out the key arguments of the book, and then I'm going to start with a number of caveats or tensions that I've kind of wrestled with as I was attempting to write the book. One is around the far right and whether they constitute a group which requires political voice. The other is this tension between visibility and voice. And then finally, voice and silence. So the removal of voice, but also the materiality that underpins voice. Then I'll move into the kind of the substance of the argument. I'll look at democracy, the relationship of democracy specifically, and protest. And then I'll outline I suppose, my original contribution, which is political voice, this concept which I build around three core elements: autonomy, representation, and constitution. In the book, I look at a number of case studies, two cases specifically. These are not a comparative analysis of the two. One is queer pride in India, based on research that I did there. I have another case which built on looking at Roma activism in Europe, which I'm not going to elaborate today, but I'm happy to talk about too. And then I'll end with some reflections. So this is the book. It's called Political Voice, Protest, Democracy, and Marginalized Groups. And the reason I wanted to write it was a lot of what I do looks at voice particularly, but I was dissatisfied with kind of the conceptualization and the theories of voice that I read. And I also thought that it was really central to a lot of what happens in protests and social movements. And I was kind of surprised that it didn't have more of a presence in those kind of academic discussions. So I wanted to kind of, amplify that and bring it out to the fore. So the key arguments that I make, the first is that political voice is a rupture to the existing political order. So it is civil disobedience that disturbs the kind of public tranquility. It is there to change and to disrupt business as usual. So, it's there to challenge the status quo, which might be dominant narratives or ideas or orthodoxies in the public realm. And it is to kind of, turn that on its head. I argue that it is crucial for marginalized groups in particular. Marginalized groups are often misrecognized, they're silenced, they're excluded and oppressed in different ways. And when we look at also at social movement studies, I don't think that we look enough at the groups themselves and the impact of the articulation of voice on the groups themselves in terms of realizing their demands, but also in terms of affirming their own public identity. It has a transformative impact through articulation. So it carries a material as well as a symbolic power. There is a clear communication that is happening through voice, but it is often intended to be dialogical. There is an interaction at play. It is not just a kind of a voice kind of articulated into the void, but it is something that requires others to hear it, to listen to, and then to respond. The voice reimagines the relationship between representation and democracy. So one of the kind of the drives also of the book was a real dissatisfaction with representative democracy and how it's conceptualized, and it's built in these kind of core pillars of participation and representation, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so I was wanted to kind of claim representation back for democracy, but to realize it through social movement activities. And finally, political voice is public and it is collective. It doesn't mean that private voices and individuals' voices don't happen, but as I conceptualize political voice, it is absolutely public and collective. Now, voice as a concept, voice, I would argue, is one of the most common, but also one of the least understood concepts in social science and humanities. Very often when I was reading around voice, it was used quite interchangeably with visibility, with presence, like The Politics of Presence by Anne Phillips, participation, representation, grassroots politics, and of course, voting. And voting is one of the most kind of common conceptualizations of voice. Kamala Harris, I think 2 weeks ago, gave a big speech and she said, your vote is your voice and your voice is your vote. So there's this conflation of voting and voice. And the problem with that is that you vote once every 4, or in the UK, sometimes every 5 years. And so what happens to your voice when you're not voting, and I think there's a problem with the procedural elements of democracy here. Voice also builds in concepts like mobilization, civil disobedience, and these contentious repertoires, but it shifts the focus to the marginalized groups themselves, who must speak up and speak out. And when they do so, they reveal hidden meanings, knowledge, positions, and experiences. Now, before I go into the substance of what I'm looking at, I'm going to start with 3 caveats or 3 issues. And I don't know that I've fully resolved these in the book, but I kind of take them out and I kind of look at them in a bit more detail. And the first kind of tension is around the far right. So I'm looking at different groups. I'm looking at protest movements, but there are protest movements on the right. And therefore, one question would be, well, does this concept apply to the far right as well? Now, marginalization can be for some a prize status. It provides a platform and is also in itself quite difficult to determine. How do we determine who is marginalized and who is not? Now, right-wing populists often claim to be marginalized. They claim to be cancelled and silenced. And this fuels culture wars based on claims to free speech. So demands to free speech are, of course, free speech is a good thing, but it is also, I would argue, a bit of a dog whistle for the far right, because it allows them to say whatever they want, usually to denigrate other groups. Now, their views may be marginal, but they are on the rise. And I know that in this country as well as many others, but they are motivated by a desire to protect the nation. So a lot of this kind of logic is based around kind of nativism, so-called to protect the nation against others. And so what they're seeking to do is to preserve the presumed integrity of the majority identity. So this is very different from the other groups that I'm looking at. And also we've seen a mainstreaming of the far right. So views that were 20 years ago quite marginal and, on the side are absolutely front page news. They are elected to the highest office in many countries around the world. They dominate the media. They are platformed. They are, I would say, overly kind of platformed and privileged. Far right views and one of the main kind of challenges with this is that far-right views are often premised on the subjugation and the exclusion of others. This is what makes them different from the groups that I'm looking at. The groups that I'm looking at, when they articulate their voice, they are attempting to reveal their own experiences and positions to rupture the status quo, whereas far-right views are actively premised on the subjugation and exclusion of others, including Roma and queer people, part two of the two groups that I look at. And a caveat within the caveat is that not all marginalized people are progressive. So there are groups in the religious right in the United States, there are gun owners and so on. And we've also seen kind of processes of pinkwashing and homo nationalism in Israel, if you look at the work of Jasper Poir. The second tension that I look at is voice and visibility. So there is this tension that runs throughout the book between sight and sound. Now, both of these are quite crucial for marginalized groups. And now voice and visibility are frequently collapsed into one another. And according to one quote by Briganti in this quite well sourced discussion on visibility, he argues visibility is a complex field where the visible and the articulatable coexist rather than excluding one another. And whenever I'm looking at voice, I'm looking at what is articulatable. I'm looking at that which is declared, shared, and expressed. Visibility is also bound up with questions of recognition, of agency, and intelligibility. And this is quite a good, excuse me, this is quite a good example. This is the AIDS memorial quilt in Washington, D.C. And if you don't know about this, this was a quilt that was kind of knitted and kind of presented and laid down in Washington. And it is a kind of reminder to the lack of interaction or the lack of intervention by the US government to halt the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. So there's kind of a visibility here, like you make something visible and you render it visible, you bring it out into a public space and you force others to reckon with it. Now, both visibility and voice draw on kind of recognition and witnessing. They're both quite powerful tools of communication, and they're expressive rather than instrumental. But the main difference here is that voice is articulated, and this articulation is central to stitching together different collective identities and solidarities to enact a state of being. And the final kind of tension to draw your attention to is the material voice. So I'm not just talking about the noise that is made through protest. So voice is more than making noise, although sound itself is, of course, crucial for protest movements. If we think about singing and chanting, the use of drums and whistles and clapping and music, etc. It's there to kind of pull people together. If you've ever been in a protest, which many of us, I guess, have, they're very stimulating in terms of the sonic dimension, although it is quite interesting that there isn't more kind of research on the sonic dimension of protest. But here I'm looking at something slightly different, because the order of democracy in the polis, which was kind of articulated by Plato, rejects the vocal and that which is spoken as being politically dangerous, destabilizing, and subversive. So the early understanding of democracy is that the less that people spoke and heard themselves or kind of spoke up, the better. And so here we have examples of the absence or the withdrawal of voice, which can be quite powerful too. Silent protest, which is used by feminists in the 1970s as a refusal to engage in structures which are ultimately designed to exclude. And so there's quite an interesting body of literature which looks at silence as a repertoire of communication as well. And here's, you can maybe read that this is a silent protest in Jerusalem involving Palestinian women in 1929. So Martin Luther King and there's lots of examples of silence and the withholding of voice. There is a temptation to say that if you're silent, you're just accepting the status quo. And I will also talk about this with regard to Audre Lorde. So moving on to democracy, I'm posing this question, can protests save democracy? And I suppose the flip side of that question is, does democracy need saving? Well, yes, it absolutely does. Democracy is in perpetual crisis. We have rising voter apathy, rising authoritarianism, increasing societal polarization, and we have this kind of systemic erosion of civil liberties all over the world. But even with all of these kind of crises, the biggest problem that democracy has is that people do not feel that it works. They do not feel that it is built for them. And there's huge dissatisfaction with how democracy functions and the impact of this on societies and our capacity to make ourselves heard. Now, part of the issue that democracy faces is that it's built on utilitarian principles. So representative democracy is a system of governance, and it's built on these utilitarian principles, which means the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So it's essentially a system of majority rule. So representative democracy is this kind of mechanism of kind of voter aggregation, where these votes are aggregated and then a mandate is given to a government to enact kind of policies and law. So it's a very procedural and mechanistic idea, but its principles are always kind of built on whatever most people want, and that is what should happen. And the idea is that when we vote, we have our say. Now, in the book, I spend a bit of time arguing that the problem with democracy is that it's built on these kind of principles of participation and representation. If you look at the kind of the kind of political theory for the last kind of 100 or many hundred years, these kind of two currents, these two pillars are kind of central to our conceptualization. And whilst I'm very critical of representative democracy, I do think participation is normatively a good thing. Representation is normatively a good thing. But my issue is that participation and representation have been kind of blunted over the years, and they've kind of left us with a quite a bland system where participation is reduced to kind of voting every 4 or 5 years, and a system of representation where people do not feel that they are represented, that they so I would say hello. They do not feel that they are represented. So the upshot is that we have very little agency, and that we have very little voice, and that we have very little control over the decisions that affect us directly. Sorry, we need to
peço para não, por favor, fechar mute.
Okay. We don't want anyone's voices to be heard. That's the message. Silence apart from me. Yeah, exactly. So there is, I think, the obvious kind of question that we keep on coming back to is like, why do we have democracy if it's not kind of really doing what it's supposed to do? And I think the most common refrain is that there's a fear of what Hydra might emerge in its place. So, it could be something much worse with, kind of a system of fascism or authoritarianism, although we're kind of moving, I think, essentially to that point anyway. It's not. It's not. Let me see. It's not working. Oh yeah. Okay. I think it's there. Okay. So my argument here is to bolster democracy by reanimating its core values. It's not to abandon them. I can be critical, and I will be very critical of representative democracy, but actually I think that protest benefits democracy by reminding us of its core purpose, which is to allow people to make themselves heard. And one thing to bear in mind is that historically, societies have actively excluded certain people and different groups. In the two cases that I present here, women and slaves. And just to kind of go into a little bit of detail on these, is that in both of these instances, it is the material voice which is withheld. So the material voice is the sound that emanates from the larynx when we compress air through our larynx, and it creates a noise, and due to the compression of air. And we have plenty of examples historically where some groups like women and slaves, their voice is withheld. So on the left, you see what's called a scold bridle. This was a torture device used on women from the 1500s to the 1800s. And you can probably just about make it out, but on the figure on the left is a man, and he's holding the skull's bridle, which is on the woman's head. And this is a metal device, which is kind of placed over her head. And you can't quite see it, but there's a clamp which holds her tongue, and the clamp is kind of held. And then she's paraded through a town or village as a form of punishment. And so she might have kind of spoken back to her husband, or she might have tried to speak up to challenge some sort of authority. And this was a kind of a form of punishment. And also, slaves were frequently muzzled, sometimes when they were working, but also often in transport, so they couldn't complain. So the idea is that a material voice can be withheld. And I think this is symbolic because it also says you are not quite fully human. We can withdraw that agency from you, and you can be silenced. And we might look at examples like these and think, well, these are quite archaic, kind of medieval practices from a bygone age, and we don't really have that anymore. But there are plenty of examples of silencing today. So if you look on, a cursory glance on social media, you'll see that some groups like women and refugees, Roma, trans folk, who are regularly shouted down, threatened with violence, and actively silenced simply for the audacity of speaking. And this discussion comes from the book by Imogen Tyler, whose work is fantastic, looking at stigma, the machinery of inequality. And she says that some groups are terrorized into silence. And so what I would argue is that maybe the technologies of subjugation may have changed. The audacity of voice still kind of provokes quite a hysterical reaction for those in power, particularly towards marginalized groups. So moving on to talk a bit more about, there's people who want to come in. Yes, please come in, So moving on to talk about protest and the power and the importance of speaking up and speaking out. We have seen quite a dramatic proliferation of protest movements around the world in the last kind of 10 or 15 years. It's not to say the protests were not around before. We all know that they've been around for a very long time. But there was this kind of dramatic proliferation from kind of Seoul to Sao Paulo, from Beirut to Bangkok, and really kind of all over the world. And what happened was that ordinary people were coming together. They were demanding rights, equality, and justice. What these kind of three master frames. And usually they were doing this in opposition to or resistance to elected representatives or the state, although this was not always the case. And this was, I ran a project looking at the Gezi Park protests a few years ago. And this is one of the images that came out of our data. So people are kind of challenging those in power. They're demanding to be heard, and they're making demands, but they're also expressing dissatisfaction as well. So since the 1960s, protest movements have led to progressive societal change. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find a progressive societal change in the last 100 years that didn't originate with some form of collective action and social movement. And so this might result in the change of laws or policies, but also attitudinal transformation, which is much harder to do. It takes a lot more time, a lot more kind of pressure. If you think about attitudes towards women or homosexuality or things like that, that takes generations to do. But it's protest and the articulation of voice, which is a sustained kind of interaction, which kind of facilitates this change. What is also quite interesting is that protest is also framed by formal politics, politicians, and mainstream media as dangerous and disruptive. So they are seen as threatening, they are seen as disruptive, they are seen as unnecessary. And some countries, like the UK, also has elaborated laws which makes protest a lot more difficult. And this is obviously something that is quite worrying in democratic regimes, given that the two should be kind of complementary, I would argue. Protests make themselves heard through various action repertoires. So protests can be articulated in a number of ways. including demonstrating, boycotting, striking. I won't kind of go through all these, but there's lots of different ways for protest movements to make themselves heard. This can be kind of the use of one's body or graffiti, engaging in kind of cultural manifestation, displaying symbols, slogans, slang, and rioting. With protest, with kind of these action repertoires, they kind of run the gamut between being violent and being obedient. They can be both, and they can also be quite dramatic, or they can be quite humdrum as well. This is a really nice image from pro-democracy protests in Sudan. And then here, of course, everybody has a smartphone. So smartphone has kind of changed the way that we do protest as well. Now, the purpose of voice is kind of fundamental to what I'm arguing. This is Voice to Parliament. This was a referendum on Indigenous voices in Australia. So some of you might be aware of this. The Australian public were asked, I mean, we can get into a discussion about whether there should be referendums on minority issues. There shouldn't be, but in this case, this was the Australian people were asked whether Indigenous people should have a voice, and it was all about voice, and that was kind of central to the debate. And 60% of the Australian people said no, Indigenous people shouldn't have a voice, and that was the end of the story. I mean, I won't go into the significance of the campaign was that it was built around voice. This was what Indigenous communities were demanding and asking for, because they were saying we are excluded, and how can these institutions make decisions on our behalf when we have no way of kind of feeding into it? And ultimately, there's a lot of kind of bound up with kind of colonialism and rights and belonging. So going back to the kind of the purpose of voice, we have these pillars of participation and representation, which are very kind of safe and stable in supporting the edifice of democracy. But political voice, I think, has much more power to transform these existing structures and to rupture the status quo. I think nothing dramatic is going to happen through democracy. It's very much kind of incremental adaptation, whereas voice has the potential to kind of demand and to realize significant change. The articulation of voice is ultimately the realization of agency. This is one of the kind of the core tenets that kind of runs through the book. This is built around the ideas of Adriana Cavarero, and she argues that voice is when a subject becomes a narratable self. When you're able to kind of speak yourself into being, and you're able to kind of share, to express your ideas. It doesn't mean that anyone's going to necessarily listen to what you have to say, but that you're able to speak and to realize your consciousness and your ideas. It does play a crucial role for visibility, for recognition, solidarity, consciousness raising, group identity formation, and also it has quite an educative and constitutive role. So it has an educative effect on the public. And then what I really look at is its constitutive role. I think that voice actually constitutes groups. It brings them into being. And finally, political voice benefits democracy because it creates a diversity of experiences, positions, demands, and knowledge, which in general will create a more robust and informed political outcome. I would also argue that it doesn't have to even do that. It doesn't it doesn't have to be funneled through and create a more responsive policy. It's important in and of itself simply because it realizes agency. So one of the tensions that I kind of hinted at the start is around silence and the materiality of voice. And Audre Lorde makes the argument that towards the end of her life, she wrote this. She was a poet, and she wrote this, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. It's like 10 pages long. It's one of the best, most interesting dynamic texts I think that you can read. And she says that if one does not speak up, then there is a tacit acceptance in the status quo. And she said, I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood, that the speaking profits me beyond any other effect. And she warns against staying silent, as inaction nurtures fear and is ultimately a betrayal to oneself. So this is where some people find this argument a little bit harder to take because of essentially what it means. What I regretted most were my silences. My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. So she argues that it is the duty, the absolute compulsion and duty of marginalized people to speak up and speak out, no matter the consequences, because we owe it to ourselves. But it does kind of put to one side the kind of the circumstances, the opportunities, and also the consequences of speaking up. So someone could be denied, they could be erased, they could be imprisoned, they could be murdered, and that has happened, of course, in the past. So this can arise from articulating one's political voice. And every day we hear examples of when someone speaks up that they are thrown in jail or they disappear or, they're threatened or they lose their job or, in some way, shape or form. So it is an action with consequences. But she says we need to understand that it is objectively necessary. And she also kind of highlights this kind of paradox of visibility, that we need to be visible in order to truly live, yet this public visibility potentially heralds contempt, annihilation, and judgment. So it's she demands that we need to do this, but there's some who argue that actually this is a step too far. We need to, if someone's life is in danger, then they shouldn't automatically have to speak up and speak out. So before I just kind of go into the case, this is the concept of voice as I've kind of set it out in the book. I wanted to kind of distill voice into its kind of core elements. And after a lot of kind of deliberation with what those might look like, I reduced it to these three: autonomy, representation, and constitution. You'll see that they are fundamental elements. They are in kind of a dialogue with one another. More autonomy does not mean less representation. More representation does not mean less constitution. They are always there in the articulation of political voice. So autonomy is the freedom to articulate, to express opinions, and to be free to make demands. And back to this idea that it is the realization of agency. It is important to note that just because you say something or express your opinion and make a demand, it doesn't mean that anyone is going to take what you say seriously or do what you say. It is simply the importance that you have the ability to do that. Representation is visibility and presence in public life. So representation has a much more external orientation. It is communicating demands outwards, and it requires interaction and the reaction of external actors. So this is the kind of how this is what is kind of communicated through voice. And also significantly, I'm trying to reclaim representation from representative democracy. And finally, constitution, which I think is probably the most complex one of the three for me. Constitution refers to the creation and the existence of a group. Actors collectively speak themselves into being. So it's bound up with notions of identity and consciousness. Whilst representation might be externally facing, constitution has an internal orientation, seeking to engage with members of the marginalized group. And so what I do is I take this kind of concept and then I apply it in two different case studies. I'll only look at one case study today, but I'm happy also to talk about Roma activism too. And the case that I'm talking about is queer activism in India. The reason I wanted to look at this case is that, the case of India is particularly complex and quite interesting because it maintained this really antiquated British colonial law, namely Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code until quite recently. This Section 377 criminalized homosexuality until 2018. So it was illegal to be gay in India until 2018. And Section 377 was abolished after years of kind of legal challenges and kind of protest action, which argued that it was unconstitutional in terms of its application to private consensual adult sexual activity. And the repeal of Section 377 has been hailed by many activists as the largest single intervention in LGBT emancipation because it applies to potentially the largest LGBT population in the world. And so the repeal from Section 377 came from challenges to the law from a coalition of queer and kind of pro-queer individuals and organizations known as Voices Against 377. I didn't know that when I started that, but again, the role of voice is central. Now, the Section 377 was supposed to be repealed. Everybody expected it to be repealed in 2013, but the judge on the said it wasn't it was a legal decision to remove it. And the judge in 2013 said that he wasn't going to change it because it only applied to a minuscule fraction. So he was basically saying, we don't need to worry about it because it's only a tiny percentage of population. But of course, if it's unconstitutional, if it discriminates one single individual in the whole of the country. So they were getting closer and closer. And then finally in 2018 is when they managed to overturn it. And Section 377, it was used sometimes to criminalize or to kind of put people in jail, but it was also used to kind of threaten people, to blackmail them, for kind of police harassment as well as physical violence. But also it kind of constructed LGBT people as this kind of deviant other who did not kind of fit as or posed a threat to the fabric of Indian society. So the queer community in India houses a wide array of identities, including Hisra, who are like a third gender, like not exactly like trans, but similar, and Khoti, who are like a effeminate cis men, alongside and sometimes overlapping with lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, and queer. So whenever I was doing the research in India, the people I was meeting were all saying queer. They didn't really use LGBT or LGBTIQ. So this was just something that wasn't kind of part, because they said that the complexity is much more diverse in India, and queer is this way of capturing and organize and understanding it. And so I wanted to understand the impacts of this repeal of Section 377. I thought, well, this is a great moment to look at the impact on the community itself. And so I started to go to these different queer prides movements and other activities as well. And so this is Queer Pride in Mumbai in 2019. So 377 was repealed in September 2018. This was the first Mumbai Pride which was in February 2019. And this was and still is the largest ever queer pride in India. It was about 20,000 people. The parade itself, it was on a Saturday afternoon, and the organizers were very clear. They wanted to be as visible, as noisy, and as, kind of in the center of the city. So it's in this Lamington Road area of Mumbai. It was very noisy. The people were kind of snaking through the city itself. What I found quite surprising was I thought there'd be a lot of police there, but there was almost no police presence, and that's because there was really no trouble. There was lots of kind of curious bystanders, looking to see what was happening, but it was very, very kind of peaceful. And I spoke to different people who were participating in the parade as well as the organizers. And they talked about this connection between coming out and collective autonomy. And for those of us who are gay, have to kind of come out like regularly throughout our lives. But the people that I was interviewing were kind of saying that this was like a collective coming out. They were kind of claiming belonging to the city, a city that kind of had denied their existence for so long, and they felt really empowered to do so. And for previous kind of pride movements, a lot of people would wear, or the participants would wear these kind of masks of them over their faces, because they were worried about getting spotted and potentially being outed. And there was like almost nobody wearing these masks during the parade itself. So that was kind of claiming belonging to the city, asserting their citizenship and their collective identity. One story of this interesting guy that I came across was a guy called Ankil, and he called himself the gay Gandhi. And his journey was one of kind of individual autonomy. And I wanted to kind of talk about the interplay between the individual and the group. And in 2013, Ankil was speaking to various local media after the judgment for Section 377 was not upheld. And he said that all the main activists were like talking to international media in English. And he thought, well, we need to talk to the local people. This is the only way that things are going to change. And so he started taking the local media. He did it all day. And then at the end of the day, he gets on this slow train back to where he lives just outside Mumbai. And he said, the slow train stops basically every single place. It takes like an hour to go. And he doesn't know what kind of came over him, but he stood up in the carriage and he said, I'm a gay man and my rights have been taken away by the Supreme Court of India. And he started to share his story. And he did it from kind of carriage to carriage on these different trains. And then when he got home, he decided that he would travel by himself and move. He traveled for 6 months. He gave up his job. He took his savings. And he ended up giving about 500 public talks in these different kind of villages and towns, often doing it on buses and local trains or the local vegetable markets. And he would always stand up and say, I am a gay man and my rights have been taken away by the Indian Supreme Court. And sometimes he would get challenged, he would get attacked, he would get threatened, but then he would also get people, and he would do it in the local languages as well. He did it in 5 different states in the northwest of India. I've never heard of anyone doing this before or in any other country. It's a very brave thing to do. But he said that he did it for himself, but also he was doing it for the kind of the collective as well. I spend a lot more time talking about this case in the book, but I should move on. Representation is, if you remember, it's the external outward facing and external expression. This was a silent protest as part of Trans Day of Remembrance in Delhi in in November 2019. So representation helps marginalized people to reveal their knowledge, experience, ideas, and struggles to the majority. And in this, it was a very dignified and quiet protest. These are all images of individuals who are trans, who have died. They've either been killed because many of them have to work in precarious jobs like sex work in order to make ends meet, because by declaring oneself as trans, you are essentially removed from society. And then, or many are who died by suicide as well. But I would argue that these are the same structures that are at play. So in this particular instance, their friends and loved ones would hold up the photograph. They would talk about their lives and what they were like and what they liked and how much they were missed. And then all the candles were kind of lit and kind of put around them as well. This was, media were invited to this. It was a very quiet form of protest. There was only about maybe 30 or 40 of us there. But I do think that it brings a certain amount of visibility which is kind of expressed. Also, pride is expressed rather than shame. And here representation communicates struggle, knowledge, experience. This is the reality of living in a marginalized position, as well as potentially what the demands of the community are. So at the time, there was a trans bill that was moving through the Indian parliament. And so they were linking some of these to broader political claims as well. And representation is often a challenge to, or an attempt to challenge negative stereotypes and to assert control. Okay, and then just finally, constitution. So constitution is the act of establishing, creating, or setting up. It requires quite a lot of internal identity work as marginalized people determine who they are. And from this, strategies for mobilization, for representation, and autonomy are built. So pride is ultimately an attempt to unite the community, to collectively stand together in public and articulate a political voice. But also that identity is not a bounded, homogenous, coherent identity like no identities ever are. And so in the case of kind of queer activism and through Pride, this says queer, Dalit, and proud. There was lots of people having banners and slogans that were held up challenging, say, Islamophobia in the queer community, or saying that they're lesbian and Dalit and so on. So they were kind of bringing together these different identities and sharing them. This was externally presented, but it also kind of sends a message to the community itself to be aware of its own diversity and heterogeneity. So pride harnesses this diversity and uses it as a strength to constitute the queer community as political subjects. Okay, my final reflections are that voice is the realization of agency, and through voice we're able to give an account of ourselves. So this is something that Judith Butler argues, or to become a narratable self. So we kind of speak ourselves into being. Voice is a rupture to the existing political order. It is a demand to be seen and to be heard. And struggle, resistance, mobilization. I think that they are all very fundamental principles of a healthy democratic society. You can have a democratic society without these things, but I would say that it's probably not going to be very healthy. And this is nothing to be feared. I think that this idea that that protest and civil disobedience is a bad thing or is too disruptive and it has no place in a civilized, so-called civilized society is wrong. Political voice reveals meaning, knowledge, experiences, identities, and positions which might otherwise remain hidden or silenced. So it brings that which is hidden out into the open. It is this kind of realization as well. And so maybe kind of go back to the final or the original question that I was asking, maybe protest does not save democracy, but I do think that it enriches it, including by broadening the scope of what it means to participate and to and represent. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Right. Can you, oh no, it's that camera there. So now we open the floor for questions. Alvaro, you can start.
Yeah. Hi.
So thanks a lot for the talk. It's fascinating. And I was actually thinking about one sentence that you said at the very beginning of the talk, saying that smartphones have changed the political landscape of the West. And I was considering how cyber activism could be understood under the terms that you have presented. So what is the role of cyber activism in making a voice of the people? Does it from the autonomy of the users, or maybe they can feel to be represented by certain hashtags and so on? So I don't know if you have thought about the topic or maybe.
So this was on social media?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we collect a few questions and then? Yeah, if there is any question at home, we have Rafael here as well. I don't know if anyone else. Okay. So at home, feel free to ask questions as well. I think Rafael was first. Go for it.
Aidan, I'd first like to thank you for your presentation and for being here today. I'll be looking forward to reading your book.
Yeah, thank you.
On your presentation, you focused on the ability to build a political voice for two different marginalized groups. You focus on queer people and you focus on Roma people. I would like to ask you how do you think that the materialistic subject of socioeconomic class intersects with that topic, right? Because, for example, we can divide people into two groups. We can divide people into non-queer and queer, but maybe there are actually four groups. There are the wealthy queer people, there are the working class queer people. And obviously the materialistic aspect has an influence, an impact on how people can express their political voice. For example, there are studies here in Portugal that say that a queer couple has more trouble finding, for example, a home to rent from a landlord than a straight couple. But these are subjects that obviously queer people from a different socioeconomic class will not face. I mean, all of these materialistic aspects will obviously probably have an influence on not only the opportunities and the resources that people can find to gain a political voice, but also on their psychological predisposition to believe that their voice matters, right? And yeah, so for example, I imagine you mentioned Kamala Harris a while back, and I remember, for example, Pete Buttigieg, which is a famous Democrat politician, who ran
transport minister.
Yeah,
I think.
And he ran for president in 2020 within the Democratic Party. And I imagine that if you're part of an elite, whether it's a financial or political elite, it would be easier to find an opportunity to gain such a political voice rather than if you're a working class person. And so, how exactly do you think that this materialistic aspect ties into all of this willingness to develop political voice. That's my question.
Yeah.
Rafael just stole my question. Thank you. No, I'm joking.
Sure.
Do you wanna?
Sure, yes, that's in some way.
Yeah.
And it's, yeah, thanks for this presentation, big fan of your work, especially on the Roma. I was wondering how, if you deal at all with this book that I haven't read yet, with alliances and solidarities between different groups and how they amplify, just as an example, like a few days ago on Saturday, there was the first workshop conference on Roma literature at the Fernando Pessoa in a public forum. So kind of like big deal, big achievement, but it happened to coincide with the demonstration of this that was kind of organized and prompt to protest the killing of a black citizen that took place recently, and that kind of mirrors at the hands of the police. So like a typical example. And there was this conversation of like, what do we do? Do we pull it off?
Yeah.
Do we carry on, but say something about it? It went ahead, but there was this kind of like, this is a space of voice that you cannot pass because it happens so seldom. But you want to be kind of in this other place, and yeah.
Yeah. These are all really good questions. I mean, Alex,
Yeah, go for it. I'm just trying to.
yeah, I think on alliances and solidarity, there, you know, history has shown that there is a lot of overlap between social movements through different kind of forms of civil society, and sometimes we learn you know, how to engage and how to organize through across different groups, and there's like, you know, a history of that, and sometimes those solidarities or those one another. You know, if you look at the history of the women's movement and inclusion of black women, as well as the inclusion of lesbians in that, has, you know, that was kind of there's times that has been fraught with kind of tensions. But there's also lots of examples that we can kind of point to where, I mean, I know LGBT Roma groups, for example, who kind of mobilize and organize. And in that particular case, there's a kind of this change in kind of public activism, as well as the kind of a certain understanding of kind of intersectionality, for example, or using the language of intersectionality or queer rights as a way of reframing how power is understood and how power is dispersed, often challenge maybe patriarchy in more kind of you know, conservative Roma societies. So I think that, and if you look at, I think in the case of Roma particularly, a lot of the kind of the Roma kind of activism and those who are really shaping the movement tend to be a younger, female, queer, using the language, you know, Spivak is their own basically public intellectual who comes to all their events. And so you know, that's really exciting, and that's only really possible by kind of, you know, trying to forge those alliances. And, you know, I think, you know, kind of going into different kind of workers' rights and workers' kind of struggles historically, whenever they have managed to build alliances, you're much stronger, because then you know, you're making the argument that actually what you're fighting against is something systemic. It's something bigger. It's around material inequalities and access and, you know, power and injustices. So you could definitely apply that to different kind of solidarities. I do think that historically some have been more successful than others. Yeah. Yeah, and just to move on, I think that the kind of this issue of class is a really pervasive one. It's kind of fundamental to, you know, to voice and how it is realized. I talk about it, but I don't give it the as much emphasis. I talk about it in relation to both the cases. So, for example, in the case of queer activism in India, whenever I was initially going out and doing interviews, I was meeting organizers of these kind of big pride movements, and they were all male, middle class, from a higher caste. Well, I don't put it in inverted commas. That's what they would say. I'm a higher caste and I'm middle class, and they were, you know, owning up to it and saying our reality is very different than being a Dalit and, you know, and gay. So they could live in the same city but they have completely different experiences. And actually the realization of voice is completely different simply because of that materiality. And I went to different events in and around. So the Pride itself was a protest, a demonstration, but there was lots of events built around that. And it was basically middle-class, wealthy men who were kind of going to these things. It was supposedly open for all. I think that it was called Queer for All, and it's like, this is not for everyone. Like this clearly isn't, and and there was also an acknowledgement of that, but it was like, well, this is just the system, and that's the way it is. And similarly with Roma as well. So you have the case of Roma who are maybe educated and who work in Brussels and Strasbourg at the Council of Europe and the European Union, and they have a very different connection and lived reality. And there are some who really are on the absolute fringes. You're living in next to rubbish dumps in rural Patarot in rural Romania, and the discrepancy and the lived realities are completely different, and the opportunities are kind of, and the affordances, and also their ability to make themselves heard as well. So that's one thing I really struggled with, because I know a lot of people who are involved in the Roma movement, and they're all educated pretty much. They're all, but they will acknowledge it as well. So how do we engage those voices within our own community who are not heard or who are silenced, and they're harder to reach? And the research that I've done previously with those harder to reach communities will say, they're not interested in kind of changing the world. They just want to kind of put food on the table. They just want to make sure that they can send their kids to school with lunch and and so on. And so that's a very different reality to someone who is and there's nothing wrong with working in the UN or something like that, but that's a very different existence. So yes, it's a very important, I would say it's a cross-cutting kind of it kind of feeds, I would say it would probably feed into any kind of conceptualization of voice. Yeah. And Alvaro, yeah, on social media, I do talk a little bit about social media, but I think that social media has kind of transformed the capacity of voice and how voice can be kind of realized. I mean, most of the debates around protest and online activism are around the technological affordances of the social media. So it just makes it a lot easier, but also it potentially also makes it dissipate quite easy as well. So if it's kind of easier to engage, and it's easier in a way sometimes to disengage, you can build up a network where your voice might be heard kind of in a more broader sense. But most of the successful movements that we see have an online and offline presence. You kind of need both. There's not many that are just kind of organizing online, exclusively. They need some sort of organizational capacity to kind of, in order to kind of put pressure on different groups. So I don't have a particular case, but I think that it could apply quite easily to social media. I mean, yeah, I did some research recently with environmental activists in California on Twitter, and how they were kind of communicating and using images to kind of communicate and build community. But it was slightly different, because it was from what I was looking at with regards to political voice, because the element one's identity as committed to the environment is slightly different than if one is queer or Roma. Yeah, but yeah, it's a good question.
Kuya has a question, and Marcin as well. At home, no one expressed so far. No, not yet. Oh, you go first.
Thank you very much for your talk. Very, very interesting. And I have two very quick questions. One point is you mentioned the positive impact of protests and protest voices on democracy, particularly representative democracy. I think as social scholars, we all agree that protest is good for democracy.
Não se ouve, peço desculpa.
Okay. I try to speak louder to make
Ok, obrigado. Thank you.
So I say that as social movement scholars, we all agree, and I think it's a little bit at the basis of our scholarship that protest is good for politics and society, and is good for democracy. And in all the paradigms that we use, the contentious politics paradigms and signatorum and democracy and disorder and Charles Tilly, but also in the most cultural perspectives. But I wanted to know more what you think concretely, in which way is good. Like, if you can mention some mechanism in the way this good impact works, and also because well, we know, and you also yourself mentioned that we are living in a period of very intense protest movements since the 2008 and after the crisis, etc. But at the same time, and also you mentioned it, and it's kind of a common idea that we are also in the times of democracy, democratic crisis. So how these two things combine in a certain way. And another point is about the voices, because social movement groups and protesters, or in general, groups are divided inside. So, and also there is injustice inside groups. And so I think how these voices work inside the groups. And because it's not and also how this, so there are also fragmented the voices inside the groups, how one voice is framed and channeled instead of the others. Because like there is not, I think that there is not a unique voice of the Roma people, and not a unique voice of the people in India. But our the decision of which is the message and which is the voice that is
Thank you, Guya. Marcin?
So thank you. Like tonight, I have a very specific question. So in this triangle of political voice, we have autonomy, then representation, constitution. So representation is an outward movement. So you voice grievances and demands, presumably towards people in power, the Supreme Court, the government, corporate power. And then you have constitution. There is an inward movement towards like groupism, right? So, so the work we've been doing also with Loughborough, that there is something in between. Like you are trying to co-opt people, right? So it's neither neither voicing demands nor speaking to your group or reinforcing your group identity. You're just, as it were, trying to attract the kind of swing voters. I mean, people who are kind of, I don't care people, like, but maybe, so there's some kind of another function that is like, you should care, like, listen to us. And it's not, so how do you, I mean, again, like others said, I haven't read the book, but so, whether you say something about it or you can perhaps say something like this kind of function of just speaking to the general public, so to speak, how important it is, what are the mechanisms.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if there's more questions in the room or at home. I think Luis has a question. Go for it, Luis.
Oh, maybe need to
No, it's no.
I was locked. I'd like to propose a question or a reflection, if you want. You mentioned that well, the core of this work is the necessity of certain groups, minorities, and so forth to have a voice, but we have a conflicting reality nowadays that is many groups are using this fundamental right of having a voice to spread misinformation. Well, in the American elections, Trump and the MAGA movement, but it's spread all over the world. And my concern is how can we reconcile this right to have a voice with the need to control misinformation, disinformation, and all those phenomena that are at the core threatening the democracies. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Maybe we go another, you can answer now with these 3 questions and then we'll do another round.
Yeah.
If you're not too tired.
Yeah, no problem. Maybe I'll do it in reverse order to Luis. Yeah, I do talk about the a bit of around misinformation, disinformation. I mean, I think that it was an observation, and I agree completely with you. I mean, so yes, it's we have a kind of cacophony of voices that are heard. As I understand political voice, it's more organized and kind of purposeful, whereas what we see on social media, particularly on certain social media platforms, especially because of the affordances of the anonymity of that. And we have these kind of bot farms that are kind of based in St. Petersburg and Moscow and Iran and lots of other places as well. So they kind of spread misinformation. They try to undermine democratic principles, and also they attack certain groups in society, and they do it under the banner of freedom of speech, which is just this. I don't see how we can quite resolve it. I did mention at the start, that banner, the kind of freedom of speech is a core. It's a human right, right? It's enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's fundamental to democracy and to democratic principles. Yet it can be, and it has been harnessed in a particular way and wielded against certain groups, often those who are vulnerable and outsiders, like migrants, refugees, and so on and so forth. So I don't have an answer to that question, simply to say, yes, it's perplexing. I don't know that there is a way around this, because if you get lured in or kind of painted into the corner of challenging this misinformation, you're essentially saying that you don't believe in the freedom of speech. And if you don't believe in the freedom of speech, I'm not sure what that makes you, but freedom of speech is one of those things that is used by all those kind of good elements in society, but also all of those kind of bad elements too. And so it is quite interesting, the journey that freedom of speech has had in the last kind of 10 years. On the question about the voices that are making demands. So there is this the representation that the voices that are articulated, and they're representing demands, but they're also just representing positions and knowledge and ideas and experiences and bringing them out. It doesn't they don't have to have an impact. They don't necessarily have to co-opt someone else. They are being brought into the public sphere and kind of brought out into the open. So they don't always have to have a purpose, which is odd, because a lot of collective action is very purposeful, it's very instrumental, and it's very rational driven. We do this to get that. And I didn't focus particularly too much on that. I was more interested in this kind of expressive dimension, which is a bit more woolly and a bit more open, but it is to kind of say that you can, by reclaiming the public sphere through queer pride, for example, in India, you're not necessarily making a demand, but you are, asserting visibility, you're asserting your own belonging and identity. And it's not, you're not necessarily having to bring in the political parties or so on. I think there's kind of there's different things at play. They don't always have to be functional, as what I'm saying. They can just be what they are. And then finally, there was a number from Guya. So yes. So how is protest good for democracy? I would say that it is a realization of the agency. I think that's probably the most obvious thing that it is. In a space that, it doesn't have to feed into democratic practices. I don't think it has to feed into representative democracy. I'm not saying this is how queer pride has improved, the Indian political landscape. It's more, this is the realization of agency for these groups. They are able to assert themselves, to bring visibility, and it has an impact on them as well. So they feel that they belong, and very often, people who are engaging in these kind of protest actions, particularly from a marginalized position, they will talk about it having a visceral reaction, very emotive, and, and feeling that they get something out of it for, that they start belonging for the very first time. In terms of the intensity of protest and democratic crisis, I don't know that I would. Yeah, I mean, the last kind of 15 years, we've seen both, right? I don't know. I mean, there's probably a paper out there, some quantitative research done by somebody to analyze it, but I don't know. I mean, it seems that they have kind of gone hand in hand, in terms of like a step in terms of democratic expression, as well as kind of democratic crisis. I think for things like that, you would need to look at the local context. You would need to look at specific countries and see how it's kind of developed. So, so if you look at, I mean, in the US, it's kind of, a lot of this, what we see now is like started with the Tea Party, which was a political movement. It was not one that we might want to care for in any way, shape, or form, but it was a right-wing political movement, and it's led us to Trump. That really, you can draw a very kind of clear line between the two, but I think that would play out quite differently in different contexts as well. And then I think you asked a question on how does voice work within or inside the groups. I think that, that's what I'm kind of looking at in terms of the constitution, because most social movements, a lot of social movement activism is kind of boring and no one sees it. It happens like meetings and documents, and it's like that kind of that stuff, but you have to do that stuff for the more kind of public manifestations as well. But I think that's where all of those kind of issues are kind of ironed out and debated and deliberated. And certainly in the case of Roma activism, you see those kind of debates. What does it mean? You have these kind of questions like, what does it mean to be Roma? Like, there isn't like an objective criteria to determine, based on religion or language or origin or, phenotype or anything like that. So you have those kind of debates that happen about what does it mean to be Roma? Does it, do you have to be poor to be Roma? Do you have to be this? And so those kind of questions get kind of played out in the quieter kind of confines of civil society, but not in the public sphere.
All right, more questions?
Oh yeah,
there's a question here. It's true. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So how do you see the emboldened increase of fascism in the political system in the form of repression of protests, such as in the pro-Palestinian protests across university campuses, impacting the actual practice of democracy?
Or environmental climate activists?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how it is in Portugal. In the UK, it's played out in some way, but in the US, it's much more. There's been a much stronger kind of clampdown in some universities. I was in Harvard in April and talking to various students who were engaged in pro-Palestine protests, and they were being kind of followed by the Harvard police, the Massachusetts police, and the FBI. And so the level of intensity, and they were also being threatened with their housing, that they weren't allowed to, no longer reside in, and being thrown off their courses, and all of this kind of stuff as well. And that's fascist. Like, this is fascistic, right? It's just it's kind of targeting people and attacking them. So in terms of I would argue that all of these kind of protests are realizing this is democracy in action, and so any repression of that is an erosion of democracy. Yeah.
All right.
In a very simple way. And Portuguese American, there's major repression and surveillance there. Also, the lobby controls the system. Yeah, I mean, yes, it does. I actually talk in the book about the NRA, and it's slightly different, but in terms of the power of lobbying, and I talk about the NRA in Washington in terms of representing so-called marginalized group and what that means. But yeah.
Right.
Can I put one question?
Okay, go for it, Carlos.
Okay, thank you. I'm just saying, I'm currently in Maputo, in Mozambique, and actually I'm in the middle of a turmoil. And we are in some sort of lockdown because of the protesters on the next 7 days. Just to put you in context, is there was some presidential elections, and there was one defeated candidate who, as well as the country, believes there was a fraud in the election. So we are somehow in our houses and expecting some violence, like gas shooting and all these confrontations with police and demonstrators. This is one question I want to like to put is somehow what I'm assisting is again the use of this anorganic lumpen following one candidate he was this prophet, and my question is am I assisting in some deterministic situation where the lumpen is always somehow manipulated by the elite, and it doesn't really is important how far the freedom of expression exists here in Mozambique or not? It's just somehow instrumentalized by the political circumstance of the moment. And the second question is my PhD regards Hong Kong situation about freedom of press, and I was there in 2019, and I'm interested in study the hybrid regimes, not exactly democratic or authoritarian, but these hybrid regimes where there are social movements sustaining democratic rights, but somehow this surveillance capitalism, in one way, I wonder if it's not a trap for those who believe in this visibility regime of freedom of expression or the rights as we know in Western countries. Thank you.
Any other question? All right, go for it.
Okay, I'll do my best. Well, first of all, I hope that you're safe and that things are not too. It sounds pretty scary, but yeah, just to clarify, the question was around the relationship between, you said Lupin?
Yeah, the lumpen, because there is no social movement as we know it. It's just like these unorganic protests in the streets following, following some social demands on regarding poverty, social justice, access to health and education, and we, of course, we are living in this post-colonial society. So there isn't exactly one social movement or one identity movement. It's just like the protest, raw protest as we know it.
It's like, yeah, a decentralized kind of coalition of different groups making
Yeah,
demands.
there's a claim to march over Maputo right now, so people are expecting 4 million next week coming from north of Maputo, north of Mozambique. It's like 3,000 kilometers, and they're claiming from March, walking like Martin Luther King went.
My goodness. I mean, yeah. I mean, 4 million people, it would make it one of the largest. I mean, I don't know the history of protest action in Mozambique, but I imagine that would make it quite a large and significant protest. And I mean, in a way, I don't think it necessarily matters if you put a group under an umbrella. Like, very often these kind of decentralized, horizontal, organic kind of bottom-up movements are often very successful because they can bring together kind of coalitions of the willing in order to kind of challenge a common enemy. That's how a lot of social movements work. There's always something to push against, whether that's a regime or a government or an ideology or whatever. But I would say that that is ultimately a kind of freedom of expression. I don't know enough about I don't think I can answer regarding kind of these hybrid regimes and surveillance capital. I think I'm probably talking about Mozambique a little bit out of my depth. But thank you for your question.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else? Maybe I could ask two things, in fact. One is that I didn't really get from your presentation, is so a marginalized group has to be a minority, or you can have a majority who is marginalized. You see what I mean?
I would say that a marginalized group is a minority. Yeah, but a minority is not always numerically inferior.
All right.
Because
But
whenever
you get my point, right?
Yeah, because I mean, historically, you can define minorities in different ways. It's usually, I actually did research on this years ago, or like the definition of minorities in international law. I was actually it's something I did for about a year, but and I can't remember the exact definition, but it was elaborated by the UN in like 77, and it's a non-dominant position because there are examples like the British Raj in India who were numerically inferior, but actually they were technically the majority if you go by objective numbers, but actually they wielded all the power. Apartheid regime in South Africa. Women, yeah. Yeah, so yes. So there are examples where, you know, you could complicate it, but what I'm looking the examples I'm looking at, yeah, they're marginalized and usually numerically inferior, but they don't have to be.
Yeah, okay. And what do you think are, because I don't think you really go into that, but what do you think are the conditions that facilitate those minorities or marginalized groups to speak up? What are the conditions that allow them to speak up? Because like I'm thinking about the Black movement in Lisbon. You know, it's something that started, I mean, it existed, but gained visibility and capacity to speak up and speak very recently. Because they were especially with that event now that there was someone, but there's been other people that have been killed over the years, but they never gained such visibility as now, for instance.
Yeah, a few years ago, I was in Amsterdam for a year, and there was a group called We Are Here, which is kind of refugees from the wave, mostly from Syria, but other countries as well. And they organized into a movement. They would squat in certain buildings, but also they would take over public spaces, and they would be, you know, essentially in the face. They would confront people of their reality that we exist, we are part of your city. And you know, and they would be kind of pushed off and housed in different parts of the city, very fragmented, and they would be kind of split up, and they weren't allowed to kind of spend very much time in any one place. And it was kind of alliances and solidarities of existing groups and civil society, which worked with them in order to kind of allow them to protest and to realize collective action. So the answer to the question is it's probably a whole host of different opportunities and structures and opportunities. It might be very different from one place to the other. I mean, that's why you'd probably need some detailed kind of ethnographic kind of research to kind of compare and contrast. But there will be common elements. I do think that depending on the community in question, you know, some element of interaction with something that existed before, I think would be fundamental, because you would learn the kind of the tools of where to kind of pull the levers of power, where to push the buttons, because, you know, very often these movements are trying to assert visibility, something that was denied before, and that part of that is accessing, you know, the streets and the squares, but also media, trying to kind of, you know, confront people of an awkward reality that they would rather forget in their own city, in the case of Lisbon or in Amsterdam. But I'm sure that we could point to lots of other cases as well where it would have a kind of similar pattern. But yeah, you know, in terms of kind of social movements and how they work, you know, there's always these, you know, elements at play. It's just a hodgepodge.
Okay. Should we? Right? Wait, there is Filipa has a question, so.
Hello, good night. My name is Filipa, and I'm doing research on young people's media practices and civic participation. And I'm studying in a public school that is marked by its cultural diversity. We have a lot of Roman as well, but also refugees in our school. And looking at the educational system, and especially citizenship education, we can see that there is still a lot of tokenism in schools, in a way that democratic projects are implemented in the curricula. So kids have access to a lot of, I would say, top-down projects, representative democracy, but we lack some kind of experiences that are more bottom-up. And curiously, we see them then outside of the school with the Fridays for Future, for example, or in Hong Kong, I remember that this colleague was also talking about it. So I would like to know your thoughts about what could be the role of the educational system and civic education in this in promoting another political voices and preparing the kids for this kind of participation, and not leaving it just for when they come out of the school. And that's it.
Yeah, that's a really it's a really good question around the role of young people, because I think there was a sense that young people lack agency and that they are, you know, very apathetic, that they're maybe not engaged in the world around them. And then we've got lots of examples of how that's not simply not true, particularly around environmental activism, the Fridays for Futures, and so on. And you have the kind of the emergence of some young people into kind of like positions of relative power who kind of inspire young people's action. I do think that schools and educational systems have a responsibility to not just kind of cover, say, you know, history and maths and all that kind of stuff. That, you know, that civic engagement is a fundamental part of it. You know, I think that some national curricula teach kind of in the UK and Ireland, we had like citizenship studies, but it wasn't really it was more about, like, you know, like, don't be bad, and, you know, it wasn't really about kind of yeah, it was kind of like be a good citizen, whereas it didn't really kind of talk about, you know, agency or, you know, organizing. And I know that, you know, there are some examples of where young people are taught about, you know, more on a kind of neighborhood level. So, you know, and that's something that, you know, kids can do. They can get together. They can, you know, preserve a park. They can go and kind of litter, kind of picking up kind of litter from a beach or whatever it happens to be. I think that all that kind of stuff is good. And I think that, you know, kids often learn by doing rather than listening. You know, it's like, if you can show people how that, you know, that they can make a difference. Schools should do that, but also parents should do that. You know, I think there's a necessity on our generation and the generation below us to teach young people the errors of our ways, and to ensure that they're much stronger to take on the challenges that they're going to have to face. Sorry, that was a bit depressing as a closing statement. But yes, I think that that's important. Yeah.
All right. If there are no more questions or comments, I would leave it here and thank Aidan for his great presentation and lecture, and for the congratulations for the book as well. And we'll see each other in the social movement seminar in what, about a month, right? The 27th of November for another presentation that we hope it is as good as yours. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.